Greetings. Welcome to everyone to a Clear Mountain interview. Today we're very, very happy to have Roshi Joan Halifax with us. Roshi Joan, thanks so much for joining us. So
it's a joy. It's a joy.
It is a joy. Well, I'll just read a quick bio for people who don't yet know Roshi Joan, and this is a extremely truncated biography. Roshi Joan has been around and doing great things in the world of service and Buddhist service for a long time. So Roshi Joan Halifax, PhD, is a Buddhist teacher, founder of Upaya Zen Center, social activist, and author. A pioneer in end-of-life care, she has lectured globally and received honors like the Pioneer Medal for Healthcare Leadership. She worked with dying cancer patients and continues teaching caregiving about end-of-life care. She directs the Project on Being with Dying, founded the Upaya Prison Project, and Nomad's Clinic in Nepal. Her books include The Human Encounter with Death and Being with Dying, and Standing at the Edge. She has been involved with the Mind and Life Institute since its inception and is founder of the Varela International Symposium. So, Roshi Joan, could you just maybe fill out that brief bio with, maybe with some of your initial moments of faith, what led you into Buddhism in particular?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think I opened up to Buddhist practice before I knew there was Buddhism. And, I've told this story before. I had polio when I was a child, and a very rare occurrence with polio is the effect of polio on the eyes. So I lost control of my eye muscles, and my eyes rolled into the top of my head, and I was virtually blind for 2 years. And in a way, it was an extraordinary gift. I was 4, and I discovered I had an inner life. And also, I was left alone a lot. And I felt very comfortable. I didn't feel abandoned. Solitude suited my disposition, though it was, in a way, enforced solitude. And in the solitude, I found deep rest and a lot of peace. So I would say, that doorway of sickness was significant in how I ended up conducting my life. When I got better, or some years later, I found myself very concerned about issues related to justice and injustice. And this was in part because the person who cared for me in the critical time of my illness was an extraordinary Black woman whose mother had been a slave. And she had a beautiful disposition and was deeply spiritual, deeply Christian. But she cared for me as if I were her own child. And that was a gift at that time, but it stayed with me for the rest of my life. And part of my deep commitment to social justice was really born out of my relationship with her. But it wasn't until my 20s, I was brought up in a Christian home. It wasn't really until my 20s when I was working in New York City, and I was in the civil rights and the anti-war movement. Vietnam was happening, and people my age were completely distraught about us bombing, carrying out a war that indeed, it had long roots in history. But what were we doing there in the name of anti-communism? And I had the opportunity to hear a talk by Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. And during that talk, I had an extremely intense experience. You know, partly it was listening to Thai urging us to stop bombing his country, knowing that he was walking on the threshold between the North and the South of Vietnam, that he did not take sides, but he was dedicated to mitigating harm. I myself was suffering from extreme moral outrage. So many of us were at this time, indeed. And I recognized, as Thich Nhat Hanh was speaking, that even though I was very embedded in the fabric of that era related to social justice. Uh-oh. Forgive the dog.
It's totally fine.
Do dogs have Buddha nature? They do, but they also bark because our wonderful plumber is here. So.
No.
In any case, I recognized that I was suffering. I was in this grip of a kind of psychosocial anguish and anger toward my own country and my own government. And in reflecting, listening to Thai, I realized that I had the opportunity to actually make a major shift in my life. It would take time, I recognized, but that shift had to do with moving from a very polarized state of mind, which was characterized by intense suffering, and a state of mind that was really grounded in what it was to be a contemplative, to have a practice, to work with the kleshas, work with my anger, work with my rage, work with my grief, my sorrow. And it was, if you will, the moment that turned my life around. Indeed. And all I wanted to do was practice, but I also wanted to protest. And I didn't see them as separate at all. And so things unfolded from there, you know, marching down Fifth Avenue, marching on the Pentagon, showing up at every rally, protest event that I possibly could, being part of a youth cadre, people in their late teens and in their 20s who really saw how destructive the mindset is, the view is that othered others, that objectified others, and also the view and the mindset that was addicted to violence. And so, you know, Dr. King, of course, was in the mix here. I never met him personally, but his Dharma was very moving to me. The Berrigan brothers, very important influences. And then, you know, I began formal practice. And I've been at it since then. So maybe continuously failing, but continuously showing up. And the edge has also been in relation to my gender. Fortunately, feminism began to show its face in the late 60s and early 70s. But I recognize that Buddhism itself was gender biased, even with the 8 heavy rules that nuns have to carry, so to speak. And this is still an issue, but, I have the age card now at 83, so I'm able to, enter into, and have for decades, in fact, but more easily, Buddhist settings as an elder, if you will. And still, I'm acutely aware of the effects of gender bias in Buddhism, not only on women and not only on men, but also on non-binary people. So we have a lot of work to do in that regard. I think you too understand that only too well. I understand it from a different vantage point. But my dedication to supporting women in the Dharma has been really unflagging for many decades. Because I think that women have such an important voice and view to bring to practice, particularly in relation to ethics, in relation to what it means to live a very upright life, in relation to the experience of care and compassion. So probably I'm here a little bit because I'm a woman and hold a position in the Buddhist world, minor to be sure, but in any case, a voice, a woman's voice in a Buddhist world that has experienced unfortunate discrimination and disparagement, but also I've stood in my values and not been daunted. So I think that's part of what women do, which is to show up no matter what. So that's a little background.
Thank you so much, Roshi. And it's interesting to see just how your polio as a child led to you, appreciating sight such that your photography is some of the more beautiful I've seen. And similarly, dealing with, navigating this gender bias has led to really seeing with clarity and compassion the situation of women in Buddhism and being an advocate for and a kind of representative of a movement towards something more balanced and wholesome. And I want to get into all those individual manifestations, but also what I found so meaningful about your story is instead of just working on the surface of social action, you have a taproot into this deep contemplative strata of what's the spiritual. And I think that's what makes your heart and actions resonate out to so many in such a powerful way. And I found the most kind of poignant and powerful depiction of this spiritual symbolism for how we operate in the world and how you move through it to be your description in an essay you wrote called Compassion in the Charnel Ground, which I think is, in some sense, the situation we all find ourselves in is cultivating compassion in the midst of a charnel ground. But your description of your first visit to the Dakini charnel ground on the western side of Mount Kailash and lying down among the bodies, there's something very profound about that story. And I'd wondered if you'd tell us about your first visit to the Dakini charnel grounds, and then we can move from there.
Well, it was very visceral, literally and figuratively. But first I want to thank you for mentioning this passion that I have around photography. Thank you for saying it. I actually have, when I got better, I received a little brownie camera from my father. It's so funny. I just remember holding it, this little square black box with a gray kind of button that you press. And I'm not a professional photographer, but I've taken literally hundreds of thousands of photographs. And in part because when I regained my sight, though my sight is not great and I'm losing it again, I saw the world differently. Part of that seeing is in your question about the charnel grounds. Part of it is reflected in the bravery of my photography. So in 1986, I hitchhiked across Tibet when there were only dirt tracks along the Brahmaputra. And I found myself on the north side of Lake Manasorovar and climbed up a cliff face into a cave and spent 9 days meditating in that cave in a stone bed that had lakeweed in it. And the remarkable thing, there were many remarkable things, but when I first sat in that cave and then laid down, I looked up on the ceiling. The ceiling was black with creosote, and I saw there was white daubs on the ceiling. And I realized that there were the constellations that hang over Lake Manasorovar. And it was so amazing. There was a little balcony outside my cave. And I would, and I had a very simple little oil lamp inside. And, I would step outside, and inside and outside were not separate. I then left that cave after 9 days. I have to thank a lama who was in a cave just down the cliff a bit. He was also meditating. I had almost no food. And I realized it was a Guru Rinpoche day, and he and 2 other monks were there, and I joined them in their puja. They saw I was very thin. And I remember the Lama gave me this handful of broken weevely rice. I was so grateful. And also a bag of sampa. Again, grateful, because I had been existing mostly on nettle soup. Nettles grow in that region. There's very little, there's no agriculture. I'd run out of food, and I was really pretty, in a pretty fundamental state, if you will. But the Lama was so jolly. He was old. I could see he couldn't see very well. I felt incredible appreciation for him. These 2 monks had been sent by the Dalai Lama, apparently, to suggest that he come to Dharamsala. Well, that's not so easy, Tibet it's China. So it was his last day or 2 of meditation on that cave. And I returned to my cave with these, handful of sampa and handful of rice. And then I came out of the cave and hitchhiked to Mount Kailash, which was quite close by. And I began my first circumambulation of the mountain in 86. And it was incredible. There was so much devotion, but also so much wildness. And it was really another world. And I vowed, I didn't enter the Dakini charnel ground that time. There's a charnel ground on the north side of Mount Kailash, and I meditated there. But I didn't realize that this west side charnel ground existed until I returned in 1999. And there realized the charnel ground on the west side of Kailash was very active, and so to speak. And I climbed up to the charnel ground in the late afternoon to sit among the remains of various deceased individuals. And there in the charnel ground, in this sort of aftermath, one of the men, he was Muslim, I believe, in Chinese army clothes. He had a big rusty knife, and he motioned for me to lay down. And I laid down in human fat and blood and skin. And he then mimed the dismembering of my own body. And honestly, you know, you're up at around, let's see, the west side of Kailash is, so Manasorovar is 14,500, Darchan's 15,000, so you're at about 16,000 feet in altitude. And you're definitely altered. Besides which, I weighed about 90 pounds. I was just kind of blown wide open. And it was another phase shift. You know, charnel ground is many things. I mean, it is a place where the dead are. And the vultures come in these sky burials to eat the flesh of the deceased. But you know, Padmasambhava has on his hat, on his head, a vulture feather, because vultures are powered by the consumption of rotten flesh and are able to fly exactly, transcend, become spiritualized through the consuming of the dead. And in a way, that symbolism had always been very important to me because, as you know, I began my work with dying people in 1970. And coming along those who were dying, which I still do, continues to be this experience of sitting with the truth of mortality, the truth of impermanence, and also how precious this human life is and how we can actualize this life to benefit others. Now, not waiting for another lifetime. So that experience, though I'd been working with dying people since 1970 and intensively, even more since 72, that experience was, in a way, quite intense and life-changing. But I realized the charnel grounds were not just, you know, the Dakini charnel ground on the west side of Kailash. In the 1960s, I was in my own charnel ground. I was also in the charnel ground of our country. And things have not changed that much, but my mind has. I'm thankful for. I'm not the same person that I was in the 1960s. So I'm more at ease with the charnel ground of my mind and more at ease with the charnel ground of our world, knowing that I will do the best I can to mitigate suffering, even though I will fail again and again.
Roshi, you're talking about this very crucial liminal space, this in-between space, in between living in the cave and walking into the world, from the interior of the cave and the exterior of the cave, from life and death. And you quote a palliative caregiver who says that the prelude to compassion is the willingness to see. And, Theravada, the school of Buddhism in Southeast Asia, one of our strong parts is our willingness to look interior, to see the suffering on the interior, our own suffering. And one of the strong features of Mahayana Buddhism of Northern Asia is the willingness to see the suffering of others. And I'm curious if you could talk about this balance. There is a quote in a Pali sutta, the Saleka Sutta, which says that how can someone who's stuck in the mud hope to rescue someone else who's stuck in the mud as well? So yeah, if you could speak to this, when do you know if you're ready to leave the cave, if you actually are able to see your own suffering? You're not trying to escape your own suffering by addressing the suffering of someone else. Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think we all need to ask ourselves.
That is a great question. And by the way, my good friend Bhikkhu Bodhi is the living example of someone who does not turn away from social, political, environmental suffering. And, he's a great practitioner, great scholar, he's a great friend. And he has not limited himself to internal exploration only. By the same token, if I look at my childhood experience of sickness, where I was thrown into my interior life, or I look at the many years of interior practice of sitting in the zendo. We just finished Rohatsu Sesshin. It's 8 days strong sitting. In January, we begin Ango, a month-long intensive. So for me, it's both and. And the both and part is there are times when it is important to take the backward step, to look deeply. Sometimes you'll be forced to, like in my childhood illness. Or recently I had a heart surgery that was not successful, followed by a second heart surgery 12 days later. I was so sick. I was in the hospital for a month, mostly in the ICU. I mean, I didn't pay any attention to the news, I can tell you. I was just in the flow of what it is to move on the edge of life and death. And not to, I couldn't sit up. So I couldn't, assume the great king of Samadhi asana at all. I was down. But practice held me. So and for months after, I'm still in recovery, but, from early June really until September, I've been quite, in another state. And these are gifts, really. These are gifts that are given, not gifts that you ask for. And as such, they are backward steps, just like Rohatsu is, just like Ango, just like the daily practice that one engages in, that familiarizes oneself with one's own mental and somatic and affective landscape. By the same token, how do you actualize the way in your everyday life? And how do you bring the Dharma to a world that could use the great pragmatics of the teachings of the Buddha and the practices developed for 2,500 years? I remember I walked in a protest. I thought it was the 60s, but actually it was in the 80s, with Thich Nhat Hanh, whose velocity was turtle-like. And it was so amazing to see, how the pushing forward of the crowd began to cease And people dropped into this slow, mindful, step-by-step velocity that completely downregulated the anxiety and anger in hundreds and hundreds of people, actualizing the way in our everyday life. And going back to the cave above Mount Kailash, that image, where the constellations were painted in the black creosote of the ceiling of the cave, and then stepping out, and there the constellations were hanging over me in the night sky. Inside and outside fundamentally are not different. And yet to see inside and outside is not separate. It takes a lot of work to decondition our tendency to polarize and categorize. And I think practice is a powerful vehicle for exactly that. In Zen, our eyes are neither closed, nor are they fully open. They are partially open. And in that way, there's no distinction between inside and outside. We dwell not simply on the threshold, but on the unification of the internal and the external.
Roshi, thank you so much for these descriptions and ways of speaking. And yeah, it strikes me that the depiction of, I hope to someday have my momentum described as turtle-like. I think I'm a ways off from that, but it reminds me of the Angulimala Sutta, where Angulimala is chasing the Buddha and asks him to stop, and the Buddha says, "I have stopped. It is you who have not stopped. I have stopped because I harm no living beings." And in terms of living with compassion in the charnel ground, and maintaining this healthy balance between internal and external, and also between, healthy, I think you call it emotionally regulated empathy versus dysregulated empathy. I find these stories in your life so meaningful in kind of being landmarks or depictions of that. And the one that I'd be interested in you maybe speaking to in this context is perhaps, if you're willing, the story of treating that little girl with burns at the Nomad clinic, and how in that moment you saw yourself caught, and then how you came back to an emotionally regulated empathy and deep compassion that held the center, and that, what that can teach the rest of us about existing with a kind of grounded compassion in the midst of a life that's very difficult.
Yeah, that was an extraordinary moment. And out of that, my view of compassion changed radically. And as you know, I developed this process or approach to the cultivation of compassion that is unusual, but applied in many different settings. But I'll share the story. Our clinic team was in a place called Simikot, which is northwestern Nepal, a large village in northwestern Nepal in the area of Humla. And we were in this wooden building, besieged by hundreds of people seeking health care, really pressing into the clinic team to the extent that we were able to work with people. And a man came into the triage area. He looked so worn. And in his arms, he was holding a bundle that was reeking. And he said nothing, and his eyes were quite hollow. And one of our doctors and a Nepali nurse walked over to him and helped him unwrap the bundle. And in the bundle was a little girl, a child, not quite an infant, but maybe she was 2 or 3, I don't know. And she had severe burns on her body, on her head, on her arms. And some of these burns were infected and suppurating. And some of the burns had maggots in them, which, you know, is kind of startling to see these white maggots in the wounds on her body, but actually they were doing good maggot work, but still it was like, yeek. And the stench coming off her body and in the rags that had been wrapped around her was really overwhelming. We brought her back to a small room in the clinic, and the Nepali nurses began to debride her wounds. We had no pediatric anesthesia, and her screams were just horrendous. And I was standing in the back of the gaggle. The nurses were doing the hard work. Our doctors were supporting the nurses, and I was supposed to be supporting the doctors. And I had over-identified with this child. She probably was close to the same age that I was when I became so ill. But really, between the smell and her screams, I lost my footing. And I had the experience of a kind of, I had the experience of a kind of vasovagal response where my blood pressure dropped. I felt like I was going to throw up, that I was going to faint. And it was really, moment of metacognition was there, like, wait a minute, you've got to get hold of yourself because you don't want to become the star in this big drama by dropping to the ground, throwing up and fainting. So I actually took my attention off the child because I had been over-identified with the child. I shifted my attention to the sensation of my feet on the floor. And as I did that, I began to experience a shift in my somatic experience where I became more regulated somatically and I stopped feeling quite so ill. And I became more present to my own situation. But something else arose, and again, it's this metacognitive experience. By downregulating, by disidentifying, by downregulating, by grounding, I had this moment where I realized I was there to serve, not distract. That's kind of simple, but not inconsequential. And the feeling I had was of, this sort of upwelling of gratitude, not for the insight, but for the Father bringing this little girl into the clinic. I remembered I was there, as I said, not to distract, but to serve. And it liberated this feeling of gratefulness, of a kind of love, of appreciation. The father had walked for days bringing this child because they knew, people in the region knew we were coming, bringing this injured child to us. And then my gratitude widened, and it included the nurses. And I was in awe of these Nepali mountain nurses who were doing this work on this child, which I couldn't imagine holding it myself. They had to cause this child suffering in order to ultimately help this child. And it was really, I was in complete, brokenhearted awe and thankfulness. And it was out of that experience on reflection that I began to see this approach to the cultivation of compassion. It's called grace, and the G of grace stands for gathering your attention, which I did put it right in my feet when I was about to lose it. And the R of grace is remember really why you're here. Recall your intention. And then the A of grace is attune to your body, to feelings that are arising, to your mind. If you need to further regulate, go back to grounding, gathering your attention. Self-attunement before I attuned to others, because I had attuned to the child before I had attuned to myself, and I had lost grounding completely. And then attune to other from a grounded perspective, knowing what's happening in your own subjectivity before you expand your subjectivity to include another. And in resonance with the physical and the emotional and the cognitive experience, which is empathy, being in resonance with the experience of another, considering the C of grace, what will really serve? And there you are, because you've created this continuum of unfolding within your own experience that widens and widens from your tight subjectivity of attention, and then remembering you're there, then, opening up through attunement and resonance, and then what will really serve here? Not necessarily finding that within the PDR, the physician's desk reference, and the algorithms and the expectations and everything, because every moment is really unique. Seeing what will serve this situation. And then the E of grace is to engage. And the last part of the E of grace is ending. So that model broke open for me in that experience in Nepal. And it was after that I received the invitation to be a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress. And it was during my time at the library that I did this heuristic map of compassion, because I recognized that in medicine there was a big deficit of compassion. That compassion actually had kind of a bad rap. And that training people in compassion was not so easy. And I wanted to see, what compassion was made of. And I recognized that compassion was made of non-compassion elements. And this heuristic map that I worked with and developed with the help of various neuroscientists and social psychologists and people in the cognitive sciences was very practical. And I also recognized the map is great. It teaches us a lot. But also, for the work that I was doing in the medical setting, I wanted to develop a tool. And so out of the map, I developed this tool called GRACE. And it's kind of wonderful because in Japan, there's a National GRACE Association. There are GRACE study groups all over Japan. I go there every year to the national meeting. And it's really, it's something, of course, that we teach at our Zen Center. We have a GRACE training, and people from, law, human rights, medicine, education come into that training. Politics, and of course, people who are practitioners. Also, the being with dying training we do at Upaya, same clinicians who are working in the end-of-life care field. And it's kind of wonderful to be in your 80s and to see, oh, well, I did one little useful thing, thank you, that might, live a little bit after me.
Yeah, Roshi, thank you so much. In this G.R.A.C.E framework, the gathering, recalling, attuning, considering, engaging, and ending, it's really helpful. For a lot of people, I include myself in this, helping others or being with others isn't an intuitive thing, and having like a clear framework that one can remember, memorize, and just try to live from is really helpful. And I think that G.R.A.C.E framework is helpful, not just in meeting the world in any kind of interaction, let alone the kind of extreme caregiving situations you describe, but just also in meditation, like sitting down for any sit, that G.R.A.C.E framework is helpful. In your book, Standing at the Edge, you mentioned 5...
I just want to thank you guys, okay? You've actually read my work. I mean, thank you. I'm honored. Okay, now, in my book, Standing at the Edge, I have to thank... Do you know how many interviews I've done with people who don't know what I've done? I don't even know what I've done, but anyway, I appreciate the respect.
These last diving into your life has been it was honestly a kind of sacred experience to see your path. It really is an honor. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Someone who's really laid a lot of the foundation and done so much of the work that we just read about. Your books have been in every monastery library that I've ever lived at, and these are in theravada forest monasteries. But in your 2018 book, Standing at the Edge, you talk about 5 edge states, which I think have a lot of overlap with the G.R.A.C.E qualities. So that's altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement. And could you just describe those, maybe you do have so many stories, any stories that might come up as well, but what is an edge state, and how does that relate to a life cultivating both the interior and the exterior?
Oh, wonderful question for me anyway. So an edge state is a state where there is great value in a quality, a process like altruism, but also there's a shadow. And the shadow is often, because of the nature of shadow, we don't recognize it. It's out of the realm of our awareness. And so altruism, for example, is a wonderful example of this, because really none of us would be here save for altruism. Thank our mothers and our fathers and those who cared for us as we were helpless infants. And that care goes on and on. But also today I'm thinking about Ahmed, the Australian man, the Muslim, who never gave a thought to his own well-being as he rushed toward the gunman who was shooting at the Jewish celebrants at Bondi Beach. He didn't think, I'm a Muslim, so what? Or the gunman I'm jumping is actually also a Muslim. He wanted to mitigate harm. And he himself was injured, as we know. And that injury, or his act rather, could have put him in the category of pathological altruism. In other words, he put himself super in harm's way. But he did it in a way that was completely spontaneous. Completely unpremeditated. He didn't see himself separate from the Jewish celebrants on Bondi Beach. He also didn't shoot the shooter. I mean, I saw this video, and the father, the shooter, is running away, and Ahmed has the gun and could have shot him, but he didn't, which I think was, an extraordinary act again, of fundamental altruism, not separating himself from the shooter, objectifying and killing the shooter. I was, that was such a powerful image for me of what healthy altruism is, even though the shooter's son, he, shot him, and I see he's surviving. But it is the non-objectification, the non-othering, the seamlessness about mitigating harm. But pathological altruism can also harm not only oneself, and I say this because so many clinicians are totally burned out in the acts of altruism that they're engaged in, or mitigating pain, suffering, harm, sickness, and don't take care of themselves. And this is true, of many individuals in human rights organizations or service organizations. Harm not only themselves, but harm the people they're endeavoring to serve by disempowering them. And also potentially harming the institution that they're serving in or they're endeavoring to serve. So this is, that's why I call it an edge state, like Ahmed. Maybe if he had been actually killed, he would have been deemed a pathological altruist, putting himself way into harm's way. Well, thank Buddha, he wasn't. And he's hailed globally as this heroic savior of, lives, even though he sustained wounds doing it. Well, look, we all sustained wounds just by being human. Some wounds are bigger than other wounds. And I think his selflessness arose naturally within him. And it's something for us to learn. But this notion of edge state is that we can go over the edge into pathological altruism. And the same with empathy. The story that I told about the little girl with burns, I went over the edge. I over-identified. I didn't objectify. I got grounded and then remembered why I was there and blah, blah, blah. You know the story. So empathy is the same thing. It's, that sweet spot between over-identification and objectification. And integrity is, of course, very important value and aspect, experience in our lives now. What is it to be upright and to see things in a whole way, not objectifying, not othering, but not see ourselves as separate from any being or thing? That is integrity. I think Thich Nhat Hanh exemplified that, and also my third Zen teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman. As we sat in the charnel grounds of Auschwitz at the selection site, hearing the names of those who had been in the camp and who had been killed in the camp, understanding that in our company were children and grandchildren of SS officers who had worked in the camp, and how not to objectify those who carried the weight of generations of Nazism, but to meet each other in a way that was characterized by care, love, and integrity. It's not to say that accountability isn't important, but when our integrity is violated, we experience, or we can engage in, moral wrongdoing and moral suffering. Lots to be said about that, but I'll just go on to respect, another edge state. So important that we actualize dignity and respect toward others and also our own situation. But so often things move into disrespect, and there's horizontal and vertical disrespect. And, I describe it in the book. Then the last edge state, but, so many other things can be edge states. These are the 5 that I settled on because I just, in working myself in the field and, human rights field, and environmental issues and medical field, the issue around, what is it to be healthily engaged in work where altruism, empathy, integrity, and respect are healthy? And what is it when you go over the edge? You're in a toxic workplace, you don't have good boundaries, where the work is meaningless or becomes meaningless, and where you haven't you're not in a right relationship with the work environment, and you engage in, at the level of pathological altruism, just burning yourself out in a way, seeking social approval or workplace approval. In Japan and Korea, people die of overwork, and people in our country too, but it's really extreme in those countries. So edge states were, something I experienced myself, but also in interacting with hundreds and hundreds of people in working in the service professions, and also in the world of human and environmental rights. Seeing if we had a language for this, if we had terms for this, and also if we had an antidote. And the antidote is compassion. And one of the ways to actualize or to access that antidote, again, comes about through this beautiful Buddhist-based, but also science-based tool of grace.
Roshi, thank you so much. And I've always said grace is my favorite word in the English language, and I'm so glad someone made an acronym out of it. We know that you have to go for a doctor's appointment soon. Can we just end with one question you can take as long as a 2-part little question that you can take as long as you want with it. Before we ask it, let us just say we're so grateful that you exist in the world and have kind of sowed the seeds of Dharma in the West such that we are blessed with the fruits. And for just your life, it really is a pleasure to meet you. And we hope you visit Seattle someday, maybe once your health is recovered. The last questions I quickly wanted to end with, and take as long as you want, is just how can we be good friends to our sisters in the Dharma? And what is your relationship like with the Buddha now? So 2 big questions, but we thought they'd be good ones to end with, and we'd feel remiss if we didn't ask them at all.
So I want to just say thank you for being friends to Dharma sisters. It's people like you, monastics like you, who really make a difference. And there are others, of course. I mean, you have made a choice that keeps you out of certain situations that would be potentially very beneficial for you as practitioners, and to receive criticism. But you've got good duck feathers. That's good. We have to stand in our values, and you are doing that. And as young men, it is so inspiring to see how your choices are reflected in not only what you stand for, but really who you are. So I just want to offer my deep gratitude, really. Oh, really, it's so cool. And I just hope more and more monastics of your gender and others step into that circle. And I mean, I love Thupten Children so much, and Jetsmapama Bhikshuni Dhammananda, who's a very close friend of mine. I mean, these women are a force for good in the world. And more women in the Dharma are stepping forward and have the duck feathers, if you will, to do it. You know, water just goes off the back of ducks. They don't drown. And I jets them up. Ani Palma, Tipton Children, and Bhikshuni Dhammananda, three great examples of that. So, you know, what do I want to do? I want to keep on and hold up the mirror. And I really enjoy showing up in gender-biased environments, by the way. You know, at Eheji Monastery, where I've taught several times, in completely monastic, there's no woman near there. And Sotaji, I receive, you know, I'm not treated badly at all. Partly it's the age card, but it's also, I don't personalize the criticism. I actually feel compassion for those who are caught in the grip of gender bias. It's diminishing for them, and to be diminished in this way is not liberating. So, and more, there's an equalization happening. So one just continues to show up. So your second question is something, what was that? Something about my
What is your relationship to the Buddha now as the final ending?
You know, for years, I was born in a Christian home, and everybody used to say, you know, Jesus is my friend. And so I feel accompanied by the Buddha always. And I probably sometimes he disapproves of me, and I take his disapproval seriously. You know, the gratitude I feel for having encountered the teachings of the Buddha and the subsequent great ancestors is boundless. I feel that Buddhism as a practice and as a philosophy and psychology at this time is so important. And we are now a kind of you know, living in a global world. It's not just local and national. And I would like to see Buddhism through the strong voices of those who have sincere practice reach more and more people, whether it's through the medium of science or the medium of practice or inspiration, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama or Bhikshuni Dhammananda and other great teachers who are alive at this time. We have to raise our voice and share the teachings widely and freely to the greatest extent possible. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. Wonderful to meet you. Thank Dave for bringing us together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And just to round it up with that E of grace in ending, and thank you so much. You know, one aphorism you often use is having a strong back and a soft front, and you live that so well that, yeah, we hope we can see it and, yeah, meet you in person someday. So
You're welcome at our wonderful Zen Center anytime.